Hello folks, happy 2014. Mark here, giving you another vinyl update. Hoping your year is off to a good start. This past holiday, I went back to Dallas, to my hometown, to visit family and friends, and no hometown visits complete without a trip to a couple of record stores, and that I did. I hit the flagship Half Price bookstore. It's down on Northwest Highway if you're ever in Dallas, and it's the biggest Half Price bookstore I've ever been to. Great vinyl selection. When I lived there, I was hitting it about once a month, always finding, different titles there. And then I also went to a store called Dead Wax Records. An old friend of mine, Brad Sigler, runs it. It's up in Carrollton, just north of Dallas. And he has a small store, but it's definitely a case of quality over quantity. He's got a lot of good stuff in there, a lot of records. And he'll be moving to a bigger space, but he carries a lot of classic rock, new wave, post-punk, psychedelic, garage, reggae, dub. I mean, you name it. If it's good, he carries it, and even some jazz. So he specializes in hard-to-find reissues and originals on vinyl and even on CD. So I went by his store and picked up a few things. So we'll start with his store. Here's what I got. 4 7-inch singles, 3 of them on a label called Analog Records. Kind of like a woman's name, Anna Log. And I'll definitely be following them because they definitely specialize in that minimal wave and minimal synth early 80s kind of stuff that's going on around out there right now. So a couple bands that are current. Twins Natalia, they're listed as being a German US act and female sung early 80s synth sound, not unlike Propaganda meets Depeche Mode. I quite liked it. This is called When We Were Young from Twins Natalia. Then I also got an act called The Silicone Scientist. It's a German guy who's released this single called Sinister Street. Definitely early 80s mute record sound, not too unlike Fad Gadget, Silicon Teens, hence Silicone Scientist. Good stuff. Just if you're into the Kraftwerk, that kind of thing, definitely up your alley. Chain of Command. This is an act from the early 80s that has been reissued on Analog Records. This 7-inch is called Some Aspects, and it's very much moody guitars and icy synth, not too far away from acts like The Cure, Sad Lovers and Giants, Dance Society. If you're into that kind of moody, gothy 80s sound, check out Chain of Command. There's one track on here that even sounds a little like New Order, kind of upbeat dance. Here's a duo out of New York City called Figure Study. This came out on the Dark Entries label, primarily a reissue label, but they also are signing new acts. And this is a single called Lesson 1 from Figure Study. Early 80s synth sound again. If you're into that mute records, early factory records kind of vibe, this is up your alley. And even the label looks like it references factory records there with the design. Again, Lesson 1 by Figure Study. Check them out. Another reissue label called Medical Records has a compilation called Electroconvulsive Therapy Volume 1, where they've reissued several early 80s obscure new wave singles from the UK and have collected them onto this album. Acts I've never heard of, like The Electronic Circus, Psychic Youth, Shazam, Arto. I haven't heard of any of these acts, but they've been collected on this album called Electroconvulsive Therapy Volume 1. Get that online, or if you're in Dallas, go to Dead Wax and find it. Also, here's the vinyl. Nice splattered vinyl there for you colored vinyl freaks. I like a little colored vinyl myself, so great little plus when you find that. Here's a Finnish new wave act from the early 80s, all female, called Bella Boris. They did 2 7-inches and a 12-inch in the early 1980s, from 80 to 85. Dark Entries has reissued their output, along with a couple of demos for an album called Once Upon a Time. So, good stuff there. Bella Boris, early 80s new wave. Here's an act called Should. This is on Captured Tracks label. It's part of their shoegaze archives. This is an act out of Austin, Texas, and this album here was originally released in 1995 under the name Shift, and it's been remastered and is on vinyl for the very first time. Good stuff, kind of down-tempo, shoegazy, kind of moody and mellow. I liked it. Should. Check them out. Jangly, late 80s sounding act, but they're a new act called the Dream Boys. This is on the Art Fag label, and it's a self-titled album. I've only heard a couple tracks from this so far, but what I heard I liked. Not too far away from acts like the Railway Children, James, that kind of thing. Liked it. Early 80s synth act called Berlin Blondes. I have a 12-inch by them called Framework, and that song is on this full length, their only full length. Came out on EMI in 1980. Berlin Blondes. If you're into Ultravox, Gary Newman, that kind of thing, check them out. The Berlin Blondes. This album's pretty hard to find, so I was glad to get a copy of that. If you like your pop a little more Baroque, in the left bank Yakko Gardner sort of vibe, check out Maston, this album called Shadows. It's on the Trouble in Mind label. Really nice, whimsical, dreamy, kind of psychedelic pop. It came out last year, so it's called Shadows by Maston. If you like Yakko Gardner, you will love that. Late 80s act called the Waltones. I had a couple of their singles, I still have them, Spell It Out and The Deepest. Well, those singles, along with an album and a couple of other singles, have been combined to this collection called The Very Best of the Waltones. And it comes in a gatefold sleeve, and it's been issued by the wonderful Optic Nerve label out of the UK. They've also done House of Love reissues, McCarthy. They're just a great little label, and they've collected all the music from the Waltones. And it's all here, all their output on blue vinyl. And there's a 7-inch I never had. It's called She Looks Right Through Me. And they put that out. They put that in there as a freebie, and it's on red vinyl. Look at that, red vinyl. And funny enough, never realized, but the Waltones, Manchester band, featured future Charlatans guitarist Mark Collins. Didn't realize that until I read the liner notes. Learn something new every day. Here's something called the British Psychedelic Trip Volume 4. I got this because it was pretty cheap. It's on the C for Miles label, a good reissue label out of the UK for 60s Psych. And this is a nice 20-song compilation. It's got an early Al Stewart track on it. And stuff that I did know was The Poets. I knew the Elastic Band, Cherry Smash, and Chocolate Watch Band, but didn't know the rest of this stuff. So it'll be interesting to hear some of this. The British Psychedelic Trip Volume 4. Ooh. Big Blancmange fan here. I have all their stuff except for their debut 7-inch, which was self-released and contained 6 songs on it called Irene and Mavis. Very, very hard to find. Well, it's been reissued now on 10-inch by the Minimal Wave label, and sounds nothing like the Blancmange you're familiar with, if you're familiar with them. Their stuff when they signed over to London got real poppy, and I love it. Very much indicative of early 80s synth pop. This is a lot more experimental, and strangely sounds rather current. It almost sounds like it was recorded last year. Very experimental, kind of nice moody pieces here. This is number 541 of 999. Irene and Mavis by Blancmange. And then the last thing I got at Dead Wax was Dome, the side project of Graham Lewis and Bruce Gilbert from Wire. This came out in 1980, right after they broke up. Wire broke up. And Dome did, I believe, 3 albums. I did never have any of them. I always steered clear of them, thinking they'd be a little bit, I don't know, atonal or too ambient for me. I've grown to like ambient a lot more over the years, but during the 80s when I was buying Wire stuff, I always avoided Dome. And now I'm kind of like, God, I wish I bought some of these albums because they're pretty hard to get. Well, Dead Wax had an original copy of their first album, and yes, I quite like it. Short, concise, good mood pieces. Some are up-tempo, some are down-tempo, some are kind of spooky. Dome. You can find this. Dig it up. I'm sure it's been issued on CD at some point. Then over to Half Price. A lot of this stuff I got for dirt cheap. They were having a 20% off everything in the sale, everything in the store sale. And so I went a little crazy. And but most of these things I got, 12-inch singles and the like, were about $2 each. So knock 20% off that, and you're down to about $1.50, or maybe a little more than that, $1.60. So here we go. Scarlet Fantastic. These are 2 people that used to be in a mid-80s band called Swan's Way. Swan's Way were a lot more jazzy, kind of like Blow Monkeys or Sade. Scarlet Fantastic, pure pop. Slick, glossy, late 80s pop. Haven't heard this yet. Not sure how much I'll love it, but definitely worth checking out, at least on my end. I love buying 12-inch singles from the 1980s, especially from the UK. Scarlet Fantastic. And again, this one is called Plug Me In. Zane Griff new wave artist from the early 1980s. I have a couple of his singles, Flowers and Figures, both included on this album called Figures. And there it is. Kind of a little like Ultravox, not too unlike that. Don't know whatever happened to him after that. Not really sure what became of Zane Griff. I know he did an album before this that was a little more rock-oriented. Madness found this, One Better Day, one of my favorite songs by them from their Keep Moving album, 1984. This was in a UK 12-inch on Stiff, and it had 3 B-sides. And so whenever I see Madness stuff, I try and pick it up. German dance act from the mid-'80s called Boytronic. This is something called Hertz. Very much not too far away from Camouflage or Erasure, any of that kind of Euro disco from the mid-1980s. Might be referred to as Italo disco now. However, this is a German act. Boytronic. Found a couple of Hugh Cornwell 12 inches from the mid-1980s. This one from 1985 called One in a Million. Found that. And I remember seeing this around in the 80s, but just never bought it. But have it now. And this one from the next year called Facts and Figures. This came out in 86. Both, a little bit slick and glossy, but you know what? So were the Stranglers albums, Oral Sculpture, and what was the one after it? Daytime, I think is what that was called. Nighttime. Anyway, the Strangler stuff, it's in keeping with that. So if you like mid-'80s Stranglers, probably like those. This was a bit of a disappointment. Beggar & Co. It's called Mule Chant Number 2. Well, I knew Beggar & Co. because they were the horn section on Spandau Ballet's second album called Diamond. And more importantly, they were the horn section on the wonderful Chant Number 1 single from Spandau Ballet. If all you know is true by them, go find Chant Number 1. That's a stomper, one of my favorite songs ever. So I thought this might be kind of like it, being that it's the horn section and they called it Chant Number 2. Nah, it's kind of mellow, watered down funk. Wasn't really that into it. Came out in 1981 in the UK. The Photos, early 80s new wave band featuring Wendy Wu and a guitarist named Steve Eagles, who later went on to form an act in the mid-90s called Bang Bang Machine. But this is a record they released on A&M in 1983 called There's Always Work. Haven't heard this one yet, but I'm curious too. Kind of like their 1981 self-titled debut album, so I'll be curious to hear how different that is. Found an album by the DBs. Now this was about $7, but with 20% off. Their 1981 album, Repercussions. Band featuring Chris Stamey, jangly guitar band, early 1980s with kind of a power pop feel to him. Chris Stamey went on to do some solo records in the 1980s and 1990s. Good stuff, the DBs. Blue Orchids, Manchester band. This is a 12-inch from 1985 I never knew about. It's called Sleepy Town, and I kind of liked it. Got a little bit of a dance beat to it, but it's not like a club song. I mean, it's just got a dancey kind of vibe. But this band featured Martin Brahma from The Fall. He had previously been in The Fall. And Blue Orchids initially signed a rough trade. Obviously, this was after that. This is in 1985 on a label called, oh, good grief, I can't even tell you, Racket Records. Don't really know much about it, but there you go. A couple more. Men Without Hats, Where Do the Boys Go? This was from their Folk of the 80s Part 3 album. I never bought the 12-inch to this, but I thought, why not? I like Men Without Hats, especially from this era. And this is on the Static label, the original Static label from the UK. If you collect albums by The Sound and Chameleons, you'll definitely know the Static label. So there you go. Where Do the Boys Go? Disco record from Brainstorm from 1979 called Don't Let Me Catch You With Your Groove Down. Brainstorm, good disco stomper from the late 70s. I had a 45 by them called We're On Our Way Home that I love dearly. So it was great to find something else by them. Last but not least, Immaculate Fools. And this album is called Hearts of Fortune. I've got their follow-up album to this called Dumb Poet, which I really, really liked. It came out over here in America. This earlier album did not. This is from 1985. And mid-80s, kind of jangly guitar with a little bit of synth going over it. Nice, catchy songs. Excuse me. I'll be curious to hear how this is. Dumb Poet I thought was a good album. So we'll find out about this. And I do have one more. This one's kind of a... Why did I buy this? So back in the early 90s, in the dance clubs, Everybody Dance Now by CNC Music Factory was a big hit. Well, a friend of mine had told me around that time that they were playing an X-rated version in some of the nightclubs called Everybody F Now by Sissy Penis Factory. And I thought, oh, that's just stupid. So I kind of forgot all about it. Well, while I'm flipping through the 12-inch at half price, what do I find? Sissy Penis Factory. I had to get it for $1.60. Now, this isn't Everybody F Now. This is their take on RuPaul's Supermodel You Better Work. But of course, it's not called that. It's called something a little more X-rated, but you can look that up yourself. And it's horrible. It sounds like Danny DeVito is singing it. It's just really, really, really awful. But you know what? I have to have a record by him. Well, I had to. Couldn't just let it sit there in the store. Anyway, that's what I picked up in Dallas. I went 15 minutes. I think that's long enough. Hope you all have a great 2014. Look forward to seeing more of your videos and more of your pictures of records that you're posting on YouTube. I love seeing those records. Talk to you soon.